Go to the website, versebyversebibleteaching.com. Daniel 7 verse 1 says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts." Daniel effectively gives us a timestamp of this vision. He says that it occurred during the first year of Belshazzar the king. We might remember Belshazzar from chapter 5 and the whole writing on the wall episode. This may be a significant point, as it would mean that this vision of Daniel's takes place well after Nebuchadnezzar's death and only 10 or so years before Babylon would ultimately fall. We'll discuss this significance as it relates to the first beast in a moment. He also says that he wrote down the dream telling the main facts. Some translations say that Daniel tells us the, quote, sum of the matter. In other words, there are details of this vision that were not given by Daniel in this account. He instead gives us the most important or main facts. The next two verses, verses 2 and 3, say, "Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other." The identity of the sea or the water in which these beasts come out of is not debated much among scholars, because Scripture in many places describe sinful humanity as the sea. For example, Isaiah 17, 12 through 13, and if you compare Revelation 13:1 and 13:11 with Revelation 17:1 and 17:15. Let me explain what I mean by that. The sea in Revelation in which the Antichrist sits and comes out of in Revelation 13 is interpreted by the angel in Revelation 17:15 as being representative of the people of the earth. It says in Revelation 17:15, "Then he said to me," that is, the angel said to John, "the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues." Therefore, these beast kingdoms arise from the water, which represents humanity. In other words, these four kingdoms are four kingdoms produced by humanity. The waters are being, quote, stirred up by the four winds. This phrase, the four winds, is often used to figuratively denote the entire known world. For example, Jeremiah 49:36, Daniel 8:8, Matthew 24:31. The phrase, the four winds, is often associated in that context with the four cardinal points of the compass, like north, south, east, and west. The cardinal points are even directly being referred to in several instances of the phrase, the four winds, in the book of Daniel, like Daniel 8:8 and Daniel 11:4. Charles Cooper, in his paper, spends a lot of time tying each of the four kingdoms here to a compass direction. Here we also find one of many grammatical clues that suggest that these four kingdoms will appear at the same time. The phrase, quote, "were stirring up," referring to the four winds stirring up the sea, actually means bursting forth suddenly, as opposed to over time. I will quote from Stephen Miller of the New American Commentary, who gives this fact even more weight because he holds to the traditional view and not the one I'm proposing. He says, quote, "Four winds of heaven were churning up the sea, as in a time of a sudden storm." The participle churning up can also mean bursting forth, and the idea seems to be that these winds suddenly burst forth upon the sea. So I would suggest that this verse is saying that there will be four kingdoms produced in four different parts of the earth quite suddenly. The next verse describes the first beast. Daniel 7:4 says, "The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it." The traditional view has this first beast being Babylon, and specifically Nebuchadnezzar. For example, they say that the wings being plucked off and it's being made to stand on 2 feet and given a heart of a man is referring to the humbling experience that God gave to Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar was forced to act like an ox for several years and eat grass until he recognized the sovereignty of God and was restored to his right mind. This part of the interpretation has many problems, the first being that Nebuchadnezzar was dead at the time of this vision based on verse 1, and it seems strange, therefore, that Daniel would see Nebuchadnezzar coming out of the sea and providing more details about his life or kingdom. Another problem that we'll see over and over again is the lack of consistency. For example, the picture the traditional view paints here is that the lion with the wings represents Nebuchadnezzar when he was forced to act like a beast. And then the plucking of the lion's wings, making it stand on 2 feet, and giving it a man's heart is symbolic of God restoring Nebuchadnezzar to his right mind at the end of Daniel 4. This would suggest that the reason for these other 4 beasts being described as beasts is because of similar situations like that of Nebuchadnezzar's. Are we to understand then that the king of Medo-Persia or Greece or Rome are also described as beasts because they too were forced to act like beasts by God? If so, they were apparently not restored to sanity as Nebuchadnezzar was, since no man's heart was given to them. Also, the description of the first beast here in Daniel 7 doesn't really even fit what happened to Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4. The clear intent here in Daniel 7 is that the lion was always a lion, but he was given a man's heart and thus changed. The lion was not restored to its natural state by the plucking of its wings and making it stand on 2 feet. It was permanently transformed. And the intent of the text, as we will see, is that it was a downgrade for the lion, not an upgrade. Nebuchadnezzar's situation was exactly reversed if you analyze this closely. And again, we have the problem of continuity. If the reason the first beast here is a beast is because of Nebuchadnezzar thinking he was an ox once, where does that leave us hermeneutically if we're trying to be consistent with the other beasts? Surely the term beast is to be understood the same way it's understood in other prophetic scriptures. That is, a way to denote a usually evil nation or king. The traditional view also will say things like, the winged lion is the traditional symbol for Babylon. Evidence of this can be seen on the Ishtar Gate from Babylon. To start out with, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that winged lions were considered to be a symbol of Babylon at all. Lions in general, regardless of wings, were associated not with Babylon, but with the goddess Ishtar. This is partly because of the reference to her loving lions in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which states of Ishtar, quote, "Thou hast loved the lion, mighty in strength." For this reason, Ishtar was often depicted with lions in sculptures and reliefs of Ishtar. Only occasionally are the lions that she's with winged, and for reasons that we will get to later. This is why lions appear on the famous Ishtar Gate, because of their association with Ishtar. But Ishtar was not even the main goddess of Babylon. She was, by all accounts, basically a minor goddess. She was, in some traditions, however, considered to be married to Marduk, who was the main god of Babylon, thereby making her the queen of Babylon by marriage in those traditions. But the reason this isn't a strong point is that there are other winged animals on the gate, like the bull, though most of the bulls on the gate don't have wings. In fact, the other 2 animals depicted on the gate, which are bulls and dragons, vastly outnumber the lions. There were 120 lions on the gate compared to 575 dragons and bulls. Incidentally, Nebuchadnezzar was really proud of the bulls and dragons on the front of the gate, where you won't find any lions. He even mentions them specifically in his inscription about why he built the gate, and he doesn't mention the lions at all. All that to say that the many commentators who try to make this point that winged lions are symbols of Babylon do so despite the historical evidence that winged lions are quite simply not symbols of Babylon at all. And when they do show up in Babylon, they are exceedingly rare. Most of the lions depicted in Babylon are without wings, and wings or not, lions are almost exclusively associated with Ishtar, who is only tangentially related to the Neo-Babylonian kingdom, and by most accounts was only a minor goddess. And to make matters worse, she was a goddess whose worship and association with lions goes back 1,000 years before this to a different kingdom altogether. People trying to make this winged lion in verse 4 be Babylon are often thinking of the so-called Lamassu. A Lamassu is a representation of a protective deity, not from Babylon, but rather thousands of years before this in the Akkadian and then Assyrian kingdoms. And although there are a lot of occasions where Lamassu have been depicted with lions' bodies, the vast majority of them are with bulls' bodies. There is some evidence that the Assyrian traditions of putting Lamassu, their protective deities, on city gates was why certain animals on other gates in later periods were given wings as well. It's a kind of tip of the hat to the older Akkadian traditions regarding these protective deities. So in summary, the problems with the idea that winged lions are symbols of Babylon are as follows. They are not symbols of Babylon according to the Babylonians, and are never referred to as such that I know of in the Babylonian writings. The Ishtar gate has lions on it because lions are a symbol of Ishtar, and even then they are not depicted on the gate nearly as much as the other animals. The concept of Lamassu was mostly represented by a bull's body and had virtually nothing to do with Babylon since they were Assyrian. I also think this interpretation causes a hermeneutical problem as well. If one is going to say that we should look for a culture's symbol for itself to decipher the following beast kingdoms, then how are we to deal with the rest of the beasts? There is not a shred of evidence that, for example, the Medo-Persians symbolized themselves with a bear. I don't even think any of the traditional commentators try to suggest that, probably because of the obvious lack of evidence. Nor did Greece make statues or reliefs symbolizing itself as a leopard, let alone Rome as the crazy beast that Daniel describes in this chapter. In other words, if you're going to say that the deciphering of the beast kingdoms in Daniel 7 can be done by looking at the artwork of the kingdom in question and seeing what symbols they describe themselves with, then it needs to be consistent at least. We would expect, in that case, to find at least some evidence that a similar hermeneutic could be applied to the other beast kingdoms in Daniel 7. That is, for example, that we should find some evidence that the Medo-Persians described themselves in some way as a bear, or that Greece described itself as a leopard. But as we will see, that's not even attempted by those promoting the traditional view. There is a similar problem with the next point, which is brought up by proponents of the traditional view, which is that Nebuchadnezzar is called both a lion and an eagle in Scripture. This is the best point that the traditional view has to offer in favor of their view for any of the four beasts, in my opinion. But even so, it should be considered that Scripture also calls Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, a lion and an eagle, too, in Hosea 8:1 and Jeremiah 50:17. A simple study of the usage of lions or eagles, or any other beast in Scripture, will reveal that they are used to designate characteristics and are often widely interchangeable among individuals or nations, as long as those individuals or nations display the characteristics of that animal described in Scripture. For example, when used in a negative sense in Scripture, lions are, among other things, strong, fearless, stealthy, frightening, destructive, and territorially protective. Satan is described as walking around like a lion, seeking whom he may devour. There is also a positive sense. There is the Lion of Judah. A lion's heart is often spoken of as bravery, and that will come up later. But the same thing can be done with eagles. Eagles are referred to for their swiftness in Scripture, for their mounting high in the air, their strength, their setting their nests in high places, and their power of vision. One Bible encyclopedia notes that eagles are a symbol of those nations whom God employs and sends forth to do a work of destruction, sweeping away whatever is decaying and putrescent. He notes about 4 or 5 different scriptures here where eagles are used in that sense. So consider that when lions and eagles are used of kings, it is used of different kings and different kingdoms. But the unifying factor is that they were both instruments of God in the judgment of Israel and displayed characteristics of the animals laid out in Scripture. Again, we have the problem of the traditional view failing at this point in trying to apply this hermeneutic to the other three beasts. For example, there is no reference to Alexander the Great or Greece as a leopard in Scripture, or to Cyrus or Medo-Persia as a bear. I would suggest that we should attempt to interpret the first beast the same way as we would interpret the others. And the most scriptural way to do that is by understanding the symbolism of the beasts by the different characteristics of that particular animal provided by Scripture.